Sussex Police have apologised for telling people not to make hateful comments about a sex offender's gender identity. Sally Ann Dixon, pictured there, has been sent to prison for 20 years after being found guilty of sexually abusing several children between 1989 and 1996 when he was known as John Stephen Dixon, but he now identifies as female. And the force sparked outrage on social media when they said, quote, "A woman convicted of historic sex offences against children." Sussex Police responded by tweeting that it does not tolerate any hateful comments toward a person's gender identity, regardless of crimes committed. However, they've since released a statement apologising for their reply and saying that it was inconsistent with their usual style of engagement. They also confirmed that Dixon's crimes were recorded as being committed by a man. Well, to talk more about this issue, I'm joined by writer and broadcaster Emma Webb and teacher and journalist Debbie Hayton. So, Debbie, I'm going to come to you first. It is quite extraordinary because most people, when people go through the transitional process, most people out of politeness will use whatever pronouns they prefer or whatever name that they prefer. But why ought we be polite to a convicted paedophile?
Well, quite. That's it. There's one thing about being polite, and there's one thing about what the police did in their original statement. It was headline, woman, you know, that was the first word they used in that. Why did they feel the need to do that? They didn't need to do that. They could have said, paedophile convicted of sex offences.
So why do you think they made that choice, rather than go down the less contentious route? Why, is it a form of goading? Is it saying this is the way you ought to address this individual?
Well, it's taken the opportunity to make a political statement in that way, which is what they were doing. So they headed out their report by making this political statement, that they felt that because somebody identified as a woman, they were a woman, irrespective of their history, irrespective of their sex. So it just asks questions. We need to ask questions about why do the police think this? You know, why did they do this? And who's been training them?
Is it not quite important, when it comes to the criminal records, for us to have a clear assessment of the sex of the perpetrators? Is that not a key?
Well, absolutely, especially in cases like this, because for sex offences, 98% of them, according to some figures which I looked at, are committed by men. So that if a small number of men identify as women, it then starts skewing the figures. We start asking questions, why are so many more women these days committing sex offences?
This is really interesting, Emma, because the police said that the biological sex of this individual wasn't relevant to the crime.
Yeah.
What Debbie's saying would seem to counter that, right?
Well, it's also very relevant just in terms of the victims. So one of the arguments for hate crime legislation in the first place is that it's important to reflect the experience of the victims. Well, these victims were sexually assaulted by a man. These are historic offences. It was from before 2004 when this person transitioned. And that is extremely relevant to their experience. So, frankly, I just think it's insane to suggest otherwise.
Well, there have been cases of people in court, women in court, having to use the pronoun of a female about the man who attacked her. I mean, that's quite a traumatic thing in of itself.
I actually think it's quite sick to demand that of a victim in that particular context. And the tweet that you mentioned there as well, that they eventually deleted and apologised for, in addition to citing hate crime legislation and basically signposting anybody who had gender-critical views, they said that anybody who had gender-critical views could basically go elsewhere and put gender-critical views in the same breath as hate crime legislation, which even with my own experience working in this area for so long now, even I was gobsmacked by the transparency of that. And so when they eventually came out and apologised for the manner in which they had engaged with the public, I imagine it probably had something to do with that, because they then had to go on and explain that that anybody who expresses their views within the law is free to do so, because what they'd essentially done is overstep the mark and say that anybody expressing gender-critical views were being hateful.
This is astonishing. Debbie, can you talk us through why it could be the case that the police seem to believe that expressing the view that there are two biological sexes is hateful? Why has that happened?
Well, it's who's been training them, Andrew. That's the question we need to ask. Who's been telling them that this is the case? And why did the police believe it?
But that's the College of Policing that have been training them. And the College of Policing have... Well, are you suggesting it must have come from there?
Well, either there or from the people who've been advising the College of Policing on what constitutes proper behaviour these days.
And, I mean, the likes of Stonewall, for instance, are in all sorts of institutions now, and they make this claim that actually to express any kind of gender-critical view is in itself hateful and transphobic. Is there a problem more broadly, do you think, with the... I mean, shouldn't the police stay out of ideology? That's what I'm saying.
Well, they're supposed to police without favour.
Yes.
You know, they're supposed to police impartially. But here's a situation when there is a very live and very toxic debate in public. The police appear to be coming down on one side of it.
And that question of toxicity is key, isn't it? Because I feel very much as though we're not getting any further with this debate. It's always excessively polarising. People are accusing each other of hate and not really getting down to, and sitting down and discussing and moving forward.
Well, it's based on identity, how people identify, and it's based on emotions and how people feel. And that's why we're not getting very far. And to try and come into this debate with arguments and trying to give reasons is sometimes you end up upsetting everybody.
We have had, though, a tweet from Suella Braverman, who intervened to say to the police, this was not... You know, it's great that here she says, Sussex Police have done well to put a dangerous criminal behind bars, but they've got it wrong by playing identity politics and denying biology, focused on catching criminals, not policing pronouns. That's quite reassuring when a senior member of the Cabinet is intervening to say that, because let's face it, and I know you're a Conservative supporter, is that fair to say, Emma? Sometimes. That actually the Conservative Party has presided over an awful lot of this over the last 12 years.
And actually, in the same vein, it gave a lot of people hope when the Harry Miller judgment came through and basically said that the recording of non-crime hate incidents was an inappropriate limit on people's free speech. And then in exactly the same week, the police knocked on Posey Parker's door and told her that she'd been reported for a hate crime or a hate incident for being, quote, untoward to a paedophile online because she made some video about safeguarding children. So actually, whilst it really does give you cause for hope when someone like Suella Braverman, and absolutely kudos to her for coming out and saying this so straightforwardly, that's very good. But actually, the problem is that the police are essentially freewheeling, and the College of Policing, you mentioned training, the College of Policing introduced this entire category of non-crime hate incidents in the first place. So I think really what has to happen is that the Home Office needs to get the College of Policing and the police themselves in check.
But, you know, Priti Patel last year instructed the College of Policing to stop recording non-crime.
And yet...
And yet they carried on, didn't they? They just carried on. And then we had the High Court ruling, which Emma has alluded to in the Harry Miller case. The High Courts are saying this is unlawful, but the police are just ignoring it. This is incredible.
Well, it is. And again, I come back to what I was saying. It's about how people feel. The police feel that this is the right thing to do. It makes them feel like good people.
Can I ask you, though, Debbie, you know, do you think, as a trans person yourself, do you think that this is all of these kind of high-profile cases, such as this convicted sex offender, I mean, that went viral, that went everywhere. Is this really helping the cause for trans rights?
No, it's not helping us at all. None of this helps. The goal used to be we had a psychological condition, we transitioned to address that, and the goal was to just get back on with life, to reintegrate into society and not make a big issue of this. But this is being made a huge issue of, and it's not helping us at all.
So, I mean, we've spoken before about Pride and what's happened to Pride and the gay rights movement and Stonewall. And a lot of people now feel that there is this conflict, which needn't necessarily be there, between LGBT people, gay people, people who are same-sex orientated, and the trans community. Is that true?
Well, there's a lot of tension over Pride, or what Pride is for, because we need to ask this question, what is it for? A lot of these rights have been won, a lot are secured. We'd be foolish to say there's no homophobia and transphobia in society. But we have the laws to protect us. We have the laws to protect us both. What is Pride for? Is it simply for people to parade and feel like good people?
But is there a case for saying, look, you can have groups like LGBT Alliance, groups that focus on sexuality, sexual orientation, and you can have groups that focus on trans rights and making sure that, you know, standing up against transphobia, but by conflating the two, you're actually causing a bit of a problem.
Well, there's a curious asymmetry here, because nobody has taken a problem with specific trans groups. There's lots of groups that just support trans people. But the moment the LGBT Alliance comes along and says, we want to support LGBT people, there's a massive fuss over that. Now, there's a case to organise together, because it tends to be the same sort of people who will harass us both.
Yes.
So it makes sense for us to organise together for a common benefit. But trans people and LGBT people, they are two different groups.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? That, actually, that's a very good point that Debbie made, that the kind of people that would harass a trans person on the street probably do fall into the same bracket as the kind of people who would harass a gay couple on the street. So is that a good case for the people to organise together?
We were discussing this, actually, before we came on air, that I think there's a real irony in the fact that, in a way, it's actually... those who would criticise people who hold the views that Debbie and I hold, who are, in a way, actually lumping in people like this criminal in with trans people. So actually, by promoting this self-ID and broadening out the, into trans-able, trans species, all these sorts of things that get lumped in together, lots of things that pull in different directions, and, as you say, have tensions between them. Actually, that is doing harm to people who have had the experience that Debbie has just described.
Can I ask you about self-ID very quickly? A lot of feminists make the point that predatory people can exploit self-ID laws, because if you say that anyone can identify however they like and have access to women's-only spaces and there can be no questions, this idea that predators can't exploit that seems to me bizarre. Yeah,
completely. And I think any common sense would tell you exactly that. And actually, I think that there's something really quite profoundly dangerous about this, because particularly with children, you're basically asking people to go against their instincts. You're asking them to doubt their own perceptions. If somebody who has a beard and comes to you and says that they're a man, you're basically training people to get in the habit of going against their judgment. And my first foray into this entire debate was when I posted something on Twitter that showed a bathroom door, and it said something to the effect of, if you see someone in this bathroom who looks like they shouldn't be here, don't say anything. And I simply posted that and said, this seems like a safeguarding problem. And that caused so much of a flare-up on social media because it was regarded as being transphobic. And so actually I think that there is a really big, profound safeguarding issue here that is, it has broader implications than just this narrow debate. And I think many women feel that they are not actually able to say common sense things in defence of themselves. And if they don't feel comfortable changing around men, they don't feel comfortable using bathrooms that are filled with men, there are safeguarding issues at stake here. And I think it's really ironic that if people who claim to want to be nice and to do the right thing would silence women and put women at risk and in danger just for their own halo polishing, basically.
I suppose, just finally, before we finish, Debbie, a lot of people and a lot of activists, trans activists, would say that when people talk about the potential for self-ID being exploited by predators, that somehow means people are suggesting that trans people are inherently predatory. And, of course, no one's saying that because they're not even talking about trans people. They're talking about men who will say they are trans, and it's a very different thing.
Well, they're proposing a safeguarding weakness. To allow anybody to identify as the opposite sex is a safeguarding weakness. And if we didn't think that that wasn't going to attract people on the lookout for safeguarding weaknesses, then we're really very naive.
Well, Debbie and Emma, thank you both very much for joining me today.